Why airplanes avoid flying directly across the Pacific Ocean. Imagine you are on an airplane, looking at a flight map and dreaming that your flight from Vladivostok to Mexico City directly crosses the Pacific Ocean. But why don't airplanes fly this way? Despite the seemingly direct route, the Pacific Ocean, not as safe as it seems. Airplanes still avoid flying directly over the vast waters of the Pacific Ocean, and there are several reasons for this. First, because of the curvature of the Earth. A direct route across the ocean is not always the shortest. But there are more important reasons. Flying over the Pacific presents pilots with many challenges. Despite the general safety of aviation, each route is carefully calculated to minimize risks in the event of an emergency. Usually airplanes fly over areas with many airports, which makes it easy to land the airliner if necessary. Landing in the middle of the ocean is much more difficult. Lack of refueling and emergency landing capabilities. One of the main reasons flights do not fly directly across the ocean is the inability to refuel in the air. A lot of flights take place within a few hours of the nearest airports, so that they can land quickly in case of an emergency. But if an airplane is flying over the ocean, the chances of a rescue operation are reduced because of its distance from the nearest cities and airports. In addition, the Pacific Ocean is notorious for storms and tempests, leading to an increased likelihood of turbulence and other hazards such as lightning. Risks of fuel loss. Another reason is fuel calculations. Because of the curvature of the Earth, a flight across the Pacific Ocean can require significantly more fuel. Even if the airplane is fueled to spare, airlines often prefer to avoid such long and costly routes. While flying across the ocean is not impossible, for example, en route to Australia, airlines always do their best to minimize possible risks. Why do airplanes rarely fly over the Pacific Ocean? Because it's closer. A look at the radar shows that airplanes rarely fly over the Pacific Ocean. But why does this happen? After all, for example, to fly from Singapore to Los Angeles directly is much closer than bypassing without crossing the Pacific Ocean. Why flights over the Pacific Ocean are so rare? We will try to understand this today. So, let's get started. Route features. Risks of fuel loss. Another reason is fuel calculation. Due to the curvature of the Earth, a flight across the Pacific Ocean can require significantly more fuel. Even if the airplane is fueled to spare, airlines often prefer to avoid such long and expensive routes. While flying across the ocean is not impossible, for example, on a route to Australia, airlines always do their best to minimize possible risks. Why airplanes rarely fly over the Pacific Ocean, since it's closer. Conclusion. Airplanes do fly over the Pacific, even though there are potential risks. However, there are not as many of them as there are over the Atlantic Ocean. For example, in addition, most air routes over the Pacific are routed as close to land as possible. The exception is a few island countries, whose routes are still routed across the ocean, because a connection to the mainland is necessary. For example, one of the most popular routes over the Pacific Ocean is a flight to Hawaii. It is considered to be an ideal place for those who do not like the noise and frantic rhythm of big cities. Hawaii is a favorite vacation spot for many Americans and other tourists, so flights here are made quite often. Despite the large airport, there are still not enough seats on the takeoff field to ensure the safety of other routes. Why pilots are wary of flying over the Pacific Ocean? Two main reasons. Flights from America to Asia and Australia have a strange peculiarity. Most airliners do not cross the ocean, but head first north to Alaska and then fly south to the Asian coast. Of all the Earth's oceans, the Pacific is the widest. A direct flight from the US to Australia would take 11 to 12 hours. This leads to some unusual effects. In a nutshell, it is safer and, strangely enough, cheaper to fly around a huge water desert. Why exactly? We'll get to the bottom of that in a moment. Reason number 1. Safety. When planning a route, air traffic controllers keep in mind the risk of airplane breakdown and the need for emergency landing. The engine or electronics can fail, and other malfunctions happen. On a curved route, there are many times more opportunities for an emergency landing, and if the airplane crashed, it would require a very extensive and expensive search and rescue operation in the Pacific Ocean. In addition, the most dangerous weather conditions occur over bodies of water. It would seem that water is softer than land, and in case of technical problems, It is easier to land than to land. But thunderstorms, which are dangerous for airplanes, occur more often over water. Therefore, pilots try to minimize the time of flight over water. Reason number 2. Economy. The route across the ocean, which looks like a straight line on a map of the Earth, is actually not a straight line at all. The Earth is shaped like a ball. Take an online globe and draw a line from Seattle to Shanghai, for example. You will immediately see that the shortest route is further north. Then you thought there's a second reason. The further the airplane flies without landing, the more fuel it has to take on board. But at the same time, its mass increases, and hence fuel consumption. It turns out to be cheaper to take on board less fuel and make 1 to 2 landings on the way for refueling. The most dangerous weather conditions for airplanes occur over water bodies. Many flights are within a few hours of the nearest airports, so that they can land quickly in case of emergency. But if an airplane is flying over the ocean, the chances of a rescue operation are reduced because of its distance from the nearest cities and airports. In addition, the Pacific Ocean is famous for storms and tempests, which entails an increased likelihood of turbulence and other hazards such as lightning. Risks of fuel loss. Another reason is fuel calculations. Because of the curvature of the Earth, a flight across the Pacific Ocean can require significantly more fuel. Even if an airplane is fueled to spare, airlines often choose to avoid these long and costly routes. Although flights across the ocean are not impossible, for example, en route to Australia, airlines always do their best to minimize possible risks. Why do airplanes rarely fly over the Pacific Ocean? Because it's closer. A look at the radar shows that airplanes rarely fly over the Pacific Ocean. But why does this happen? After all, for example, to fly from Singapore to Los Angeles directly is much closer than bypassing without crossing the Pacific Ocean. Why flights over the Pacific Ocean are so rare? We will try to understand this today. So, let's get started. Features of the route. One, if you look at the route of almost any airplane, you can replace that airplanes do not fly along straight segments, but only along curved lines. There is an explanation for this. The point is that usually the path of any aircraft passes along the air corridor, which is controlled in special centers located along the route. During the flight, pilots keep in touch with dispatchers from the center if the situation in the air corridor changes. For example, there are unfavorable weather conditions. The dispatcher informs the pilots about it. Those in turn adjust the flight route or completely change it to bypass dangerous areas. As a result, it saves the lives of those in the air. This is one of the reasons why, if you need to get from Singapore, for example, in Los Angeles, that is, the aircraft will not cross the Pacific Ocean airspace, but will fly along the land along the air corridor, being in the vicinity of airports on land and maintaining constant communication with dispatchers from special centers. 2. Inaccuracies on maps. Flat maps have many inaccuracies. Because of this, the distances between objects on the map in reality are often completely different. Our planet is not flat and has a spherical shape, so the shortest distance on the surface of the sphere is not a straight line from point A to point B, but some line in the form of an arc, which is built taking into account the spherical shape of the Earth's surface. Therefore, usually all airplane routes are laid out not in a straight line, but in an arc-shaped line. This is especially noticeable when an airplane makes a long flight. For example, the flight route from Singapore to Los Angeles. In fact, an airplane flying closer to land in a curved line will reach its intended target much faster than a ship flying exclusively in a straight line. Exceptions. However, sometimes there are exceptions when airplanes do decide to fly across the Pacific Ocean without going around it. There are several island states in the Pacific Ocean, such as Vanuatu, Fiji, Hawaii, Samoa, and others. They simply need to have communications with the mainland. For this reason, despite the possible risks and inconveniences, airplanes do have to fly across the ocean directly.